Two and a Half Admins, episode 208. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. Your victim's Windows PC fully patched? Just force undo its updates and exploit away.
Yeah, so this is some news coming out of the Black Hat conference going on in Vegas. And it turns out that there's a way to convince Windows Update to uninstall the updates and basically return to a previous version that's known to be vulnerable, where you can then exploit the machine.
Which, honestly, wow, it's hard to even know what to say about that. It should not be a reasonable attack vector for somebody else to use, or for you to have to worry about that they can just roll your system back until it's once again vulnerable to old crusty exploits.
Mostly just because if something was broken, you couldn't as easily roll back and get rid of the security update that broke stuff. But if the bad guys need to do it, they can do it super easily.
You do need to have administrative access though. So you're basically looking to chain this with another vulnerability.
Well, yeah, this is a toehold attack. Not meaning the kind of attack you use to gain a toehold, but meaning once you've got a toehold, you do something like this to further entrench yourself in the system. Basically, with the ability to literally roll the entire version of Windows back to earlier ones, you can open up avenues for further exploits that may not be immediately obvious to the admins or the users of the attacked systems. Are you positive you would immediately notice if your Windows 10 went from the H2 to the H1 of the same year?
I don't think I would.
Like, what would it take? Would you notice just looking at the desktop? I don't think you would, but it would drastically change the scope of, what CVEs you had to worry about.
Yeah, so this was inspired by other work done by Black Lotus with their UEFI bootkit that downgraded the Windows Boot Manager to an exploitable version so that secure boot could be bypassed. And they're like, well, if we can do that. So the quote here is, I found a way to take over Windows Update to update the system, but with control over all of the actual update contents. I was able to downgrade the OS kernel, roll back DLLs, drivers, basically everything that I wanted. I say the entire virtualization stack is vulnerable to these downgrades as well. It's simple to downgrade Credential Guard, the secure kernel, and even the hypervisor itself, and compromise the hypervisor given even more privileges than the kernel, which makes it even more valuable.
And as of time of recording, Microsoft haven't actually patched this yet. They've acknowledged it, but the patch is going to be coming soon.
Yeah, so they have some recommended actions if you are worried about this. They recommend configuring audit object access to monitor for attempts to access files and create new handles and read-write operations. To audit users with permissions to perform the update and restore operations, ensure only the right users are actually doing that, and implementing access control lists and discretionary access control lists on access and modification of update files, and performing restore operations to make sure that only the right administrators can actually perform these functions.
And gentle listeners, if what you were hearing while Alan quoted that was Microsoft recommends that people use their actual valuable human time to go through their entire system with a fine-tooth comb unless and until this is finally fixed, you're correct. That's what they said. This whole idea of enable audits and make sure that nothing went wrong. You'll notice that no tools were mentioned, either Microsoft or a third party. It's literally just you should be frantically going over your system manually looking for problems and make sure you enable lots more debug info before you do. So practically speaking, and unless you're an enterprise that is taking security really, really seriously, this suggested mitigation is honestly out of reach.
Yeah, it's basically enable all this auditing and then sit there and watch it until the patch comes out, seeing if anybody did an update or restore that wasn't what you meant for someone to do. And at a bigger enterprise, it's probably even less practical knowing the number of machines you have. Maybe you have better systems for reducing the audit logs and getting down to meaningful information, but this is the type of thing that CrowdStrike is supposed to take care of, but you uninstalled that a couple weeks ago, right?
There's another Windows vulnerability, this time with the TCP IP stack.
So specifically the IPv6 stack. This one does have a fix, but has very few details because I'm guessing given any details, people could figure out what the exploit is very quickly. So this has a CVS score of 9.8 out of 10 to give you an idea of how severe it is. And the boils down to basically an unauthenticated attacker could repeatedly send some IPv6 packets to a Windows machine. And if those included specially crafted packets, the Windows machine could enable remote code execution. Thinking all the way back to like Windows 95, it's the ping of death. You can send a couple of packets and the machine is just going to start running the code you provide.
IPv6, it makes all the old vulnerabilities new again.
Under the mitigation section for this Windows CVE, Microsoft says, mitigation refers to a setting, common configuration, or general best practice existing in a default state that could reduce the severity of exploitation of a vulnerability. The following mitigation factors might be helpful in your situation. Systems are not affected if IPv6 is disabled on the target machine.
And no second thing. That's it. That's your mitigation. No IPv6 for you.
but it wasn't even like, here's how you go and disable IPv6. It's just, if it wasn't on, you couldn't be exploited. Hint, hint. It's like, that's not how these security messages should go in the mitigation section. It should be telling you how to do that if you need to.
Let's be honest here, Alan. How many Windows sysadmins are there out there who have not already long since learned how to disable IPv6 for one reason or another? I have never had to disable the IPv6 stack on a Linux or a BSD machine, but Windows machines, I have long since lost count of the machines that have disabled IPv6 stack because the Windows IPv6 stack was misbehaving catastrophically in one fashion or another, and the easiest way around it was just to disable the whole damn thing.
I haven't had to, like the last time I did it was on a VPN connection like 15 years ago to just make sure it only did v4, not v6 over the VPN.
I have had issues with Windows machines and the IPv6 stack innumerable times. I can't even remember all the applications that have had issues, or you'll wind up like some app is determined to only use IPv6 despite the fact that you don't actually have working IPv6 outside the office to the internet, but you just can't make it not do it unless you disable the IPv6 stack. And usually there's some other mitigation available for whatever random paper cut is currently, bleeding you out on IPv6 on Windows, but it's also usually like really complicated and might work or might not work versus just tick off that little radio button for IPv6 and the problems go away.
Well, good luck trying to get me with this. My ISP doesn't support IPv6.
Neither does mine.
But if your laptop has Wi-Fi, Windows has the v6 on by default, you don't have to come over the internet to send you an IPv6 packet.
Yeah. Doesn't matter if your laptop is connected to Wi-Fi or not. Just if you have a local network and an attacker can get onto your local network, they can flood you with IPv6. And some of it may be, quote, specially crafted.
Yeah. Depending on how some things work, it might even be possible to connect over v6 from a website. Like the browser could connect to your machine. In the recent weeks, they've been talking about this 0.0.0.0 vulnerability where that's not on the list of addresses you shouldn't be able to connect to. And I'm guessing there's too many possible IPv6 addresses that are interpreted as this machine where they might be able to do something like that as well.
I wonder if you could use it for a privilege escalation exploit. Like if you've already got a toehold on the machine, but no admin, literally flood localhost with IPv6.
Yeah, quite likely. And then you could chain that with the other one and then uninstall the updates.
Yep. Here's your all-in-one Swiss Army knife can opener for Windows laptops everywhere. I shouldn't say laptops, Windows systems of all shapes, sizes, and flavors.
Every version of Windows that's currently supported is vulnerable to this. So, even the earliest versions of Windows 10, I think the only reason they don't list Windows 7 is that it's not in support anymore. All the versions of Windows 11, including interesting versions of Windows 11 that generally aren't available to everybody yet, have fixes, and we'll explain that in a sec. And even, all the way back to Windows Server 2008, because that's still supported, they have patches for 2008, 2012, 2016, 2019, and Server 2022.
What this really tells you is this has been a flaw that has existed in the Windows IPv6 stack for a very long time.
Yep. And looking at the little breakdown they have at the top, the weakness that's identified is the common coding error integer underflow. So somewhere in the code, there's a subtraction where they take away a number, and the attacker has some ability to specify a very big number. And when you take away a big number from a small number, you normally get a negative number. But if in the code that number is an unsigned number, then you get an underflow, and what you actually end up with is a really, really big number. And if that number means Windows now accesses memory beyond the end of a thing, you can end up being like, hey, actually run some code that's pointed to by this big number.
So what you're saying is when you subtract a larger number from a smaller number, Sub-Zero wins.
Exactly. And back to the other thing, in their little FAQ, in addition to, how could an attacker exploit this vulnerability where they say, well, they could send you some packets and then you'd be owned. They also say, Windows 11 24H2 is not generally available yet. Why are there updates for this version of Windows listed in the security update table? It turns out all those new Copilot Plus devices that have all that weird AI with the Qualcomm processors, well, those are now generally publicly available, and they come by default with Windows 11 24H2 that's not available to anybody else yet. Consumers with these devices need to know about any vulnerabilities that affect their machines, and they need to install the updates if they've not received automatic updates. Note that the general availability date for Windows 11 24H2 is scheduled for sometime later this year.
But either way, you're running essentially a beta version of Windows.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing that leaps out to me is, it's all of the big software development companies have just decided that, you know what, screw it. Beta software is where it's at. We'll fix things later. When even Microsoft is saying, well, we have this new class of devices. We don't want to release that out in the wild with the old stable version of Windows. That beta one right around the corner, that's basically ready. Let's use that.
Well, you have to remember, this is also technically the version for ARM, so it probably needed the newer version. Like the older version of Windows doesn't work on ARM.
Which, that's cool, but that doesn't change the fact that we're still talking about releasing devices using an unreleased operating system, which is a little dodgy.
For sure.
If you need to rush it, then you can release the new version early, but I can't really get on board with saying, oh, hey, these are production devices we're releasing with not yet production operating systems. Like, no, man, if you sold it, it's production.
Yeah, and really your point there is even more severe when you realize that, so that version, that beta went to production, to printing months ago if it's built into these machines that shipped last month. So it's not just a beta of Windows, it's like a 6-month-old beta of Windows.
Yeah, but it'll just update itself the first time you turn it on. It'll be fine.
Unless you roll back the updates.
Yeah. Or unless something else goes wrong with Windows Update, but hey, Windows Update's super reliable. It's not like that dodgy apt or DNF stuff, right? Windows Update always works. We've never gone for month-long periods when it might take 3 straight days to update a brand new laptop to the newest version of Windows.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by Automox. Are you prepared for whatever shitstorm may hit your desk during the workday? Automox has your back. Check out the brand new Autonomous IT podcast. Listen in as various IT experts discuss the latest Patch Tuesday releases, mitigation tips, and custom automations to help with CVE remediations. Make new work friends. Listen now to the Autonomous IT podcast on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you tune into your podcasts. Jim, remind me what CPU you've got in that machine that you're using to record today.
The studio machine's running on a Ryzen 3700X.
All right, so it will have definitely been patched against this SyncClose bug then.
Of course not. Why would it be?
Oh.
It won't be anything new. This same machine had the random number generator bug that made me unable to use WireGuard for a couple of months until that got sorted out. I really do love the Ryzen line of processors from AMD. They're extremely fast. They're flexible. They offer pretty much all of the features of, enterprise grade, server processors in a consumer format. But AMD didn't have the smoothest start with the Ryzen 2000 and 3000 series. There have been quite a few hardware bugs in them. Generally, they're addressable via microcode fixes, but those can take a while to apply. And in this case, as Joe's alluding, we have a new hardware bug. And by new, I mean newly discovered hardware bug in the Ryzen 3000 series and other series. But the 3000s, they're not going to get a patch at all. AMD's just like, nah, that's old. Why bother?
I think part of that has to do with the patches generally being a fix that goes in for the microcode but comes from the firmware. It means they have to coordinate with the BIOS vendors to actually release it. And so that's each motherboard manufacturer. But yeah, I guess they've decided that the 3000 is just too old to bother with.
And I would just like once again to say that I think that system that depends on the CPU vendor coordinating with every individual motherboard manufacturer to patch a bug that they let come out of the factory absolutely sucks rocks, and the industry needs to figure out a better way to handle that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess the firmware that runs on the motherboard makes sense that it comes from the motherboard manufacturer, although really it comes from one of a couple of firmware manufacturers that then let the motherboard manufacturer stamp their logo on it and make it worse, as we talked about with the problem with the secure boot keys. But yeah, should there be a separate bit of firmware somewhere where the CPU's firmware or microcode can get updated separately from the motherboard firmware. And I know some of the ARM processors have multiple different firmwares effectively, where there's like one that controls the secure enclave and one that controls the CPU stuff, and then another one that's actually the BIOS. And updating your firmware, suddenly you have 5 firmwares to update and try to manage the right version of, and that's not necessarily better either. But being able to get things more direct from the vendor who's responsible for it does seem like a better thing. Like if you remember back in the days, especially early days of Android, where every phone company would then skunk up a version of the phone manufacturer's version of Android. And it meant, there was 6 months between each security update. That was also terrible.
Well, you see, what you should have done, Jim, was buy a relatively new 13th gen Intel CPU like me. I've got my 13900K, which is absolutely fine with no problems at all.
But before we move on to Intel's problems, we should probably talk about what the SyncClose bug in the AMD processors like my Ryzen 3700X really is. And the answer is, it's an issue that potentially allows an attacker to run code in a very, very privileged mode that shouldn't be accessible to them, called System Management Mode. SMM mode is designed to be reserved only for a specific protected portion of firmware. The researchers who discovered SyncClose warn that it affects pretty much every AMD chip dating back to 2006, maybe even earlier, although hopefully there aren't too many people out there who are concerned about vulnerabilities in AMD processors older than 2006, which I'll remind you, that's 18 years ago. Now, the good news is an attacker does already have to have like a pretty serious foothold on a machine to actually make use of SyncClose. The real utility of SyncClose is not to get access to a system, it's to become almost impossible to dislodge from a system. You can use this vulnerability to essentially create a boot rootkit that is invisible to the operating system and cannot be detected by pretty much anything because, again, it's not even running as like ring 0 code. It's running at a privilege level that is essentially reserved typically for the security coprocessor on the CPU itself. So this is way, way more privileged than anything, including your actual operating system, would normally have access to.
Yeah, and so the article goes on, like, imagine a nation state hacker or whoever wants to have persistent access to your system. So they get into this SMM mode and are able to install their code so that it happens before boot, effectively. So even if you wipe your drive clean or you like throw away the hard drive and burn it because it was compromised by the nation state, and you take a brand new virgin hard drive and you plug it into the system and it's exploited, because short of having direct access to the memory chips and using an SPI flash programming tool to overwrite the memory with a known good firmware, the malware is still going to be there. And it's just going to reinstall itself every time you replace the hardware or reformat the operating system or whatever. The virus is running well outside the operating system. It's not on any of the chips or hardware that you generally have access to. It is buried deep inside the guts of the CPU.
Okay, so that pretty much wraps it up for AMD and the SyncClose problems that it's having with its processors. So let's move on to Intel and why Joe's processor sucks. Joe has a nice new 13th gen i9, and unfortunately, it is potentially susceptible to permanent damage due to overvoltage. This is a firmware bug that's affecting all of the Raptor Lake, that means 13th and 14th gen CPUs. It was initially thought mostly to be a problem with the i9s, but since then, we've discovered that, no, actually it affects potentially i5s and i7s as well. So basically, if you've got a Raptor Lake processor, you probably want to take it easy on that thing until the actual updates have been delivered yet to resolve the issue.
I think the i9s were probably more likely to display it because they're running a higher voltage and closer to the edge. But this firmware bug means that any of the processors can get overvolted. And when that happens, they basically get physically damaged and your processor is cooked now. So Intel's going to extend the warranty on those, but that's a big issue.
Remember when you had to delid your processor and connect leads with a graphite pencil before you could burn it out with overvoltage? Pepperidge Farm remembers, but that's not the case anymore.
Yeah, and I'm concerned about my one because I got it off Amazon and I don't fancy my chances of getting that extended warranty somehow. So I'm waiting for a firmware update. There is one available in beta, but I don't really want to flash that. I'm kind of waiting for them to call it stable.
But it sounds like if you have one that's actually experiencing the crashes, the firmware won't fix it. You literally have to warranty the processor. It's just the BIOS fix should prevent them from getting damaged to then consistently crash.
Well, that's the thing. I have, touch wood, not seen anything like this. I think that might be because I don't really work it that hard. Like when I'm exporting audio or transcoding something, briefly it gets pegged, but I'm not playing games on it, which can peg it for hours on end.
Or doing big software, compile jobs, which can do the same thing, yeah.
Which I generally don't do. Like I only burst it for maybe 10 minutes at a time.
There are some other things that you could try. The Verge mentions that several different motherboard manufacturers have issued BIOS updates, which hopefully will help mitigate the problem until the real fix is released. You could also literally just go into your BIOS if you're familiar with, making modifications to your system's, clock speeds and voltages. You could undervolt the processor to try to avoid this. Now, obviously, that would have performance implications in the meantime. You wouldn't be able to get the full performance out of the rig, but in some cases, that might be preferable to just frying the sucker when you played 1 hour too many of Cyberpunk.
Well, and right to that point is is Intel's official fix for this actually going to have a performance degradation where my processor was fast and now it's slower because it's been undervolted a bit so it doesn't literally cook itself?
I don't know, Alan. Releasing a fix for a flaw in a processor that massively degrades its performance? That doesn't sound like something Intel would do.
Meltdown.
Spectre.
Etc. But it has raised some questions about what more would it take before Intel would actually have to recall these processors? Or at least take all the ones that haven't been sold yet and pull them off the shelf and make sure that new ones you buy don't have this problem. But, we've seen Intel announcing layoffs and that they don't have enough money and so on. So I think they're trying really hard to avoid that and possibly doing themselves more reputation damage in the meantime.
That's a really interesting point, Alan, because you mentioned recalls, and in the automotive world, there would absolutely be a recall for this. Matter of fact, even the actions we're already talking about with software patches over the air, those are called recalls in the automotive world. And it gets taken a lot more seriously because the idea here is that, it's a car. You can get on the highway and you can kill people. And this is just a computer, right? The only thing is, I don't think society is doing a real good job of realizing the rate at which, your ability to just perform basic computing tasks, it's not a luxury, it's a necessity to function in society.
Yeah, and it's also why if you check your motherboard manual, most of them contain a little clause about please don't use our hardware to run a nuclear power plant. It's not good enough for that.
Now taking bets on the percentage of even this show's listeners who've actually read their motherboard manual.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by people who support us with PayPal and Patreon. Go to 2.5admins.com/support for details of how you can support us too. Patreon supporters have the option to listen to episodes without ads like this. And it's not just this show. There's Late Night Linux for news, discoveries, audience input, and misanthropy. Linux Matters for upbeat family-friendly adventures. Linux After Dark for silly challenges and philosophical debates. Linux Dev Time about developing with and for Linux. Hybrid Cloud Show for everything public and private cloud. And Ask the Hosts for off-topic questions from you. You can even get some episodes a bit early. We've got a lot going on, and it's only possible because of the people who support us. So if you like what we do and can afford it, it would be great if you could support us too at 2.5admins.com/support. Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. And if you want to send any questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Another perk of being a patron is you get to skip the queue, which is what John has done. He writes, I'm using Samba to share files from a Linux machine that is joined to a Windows Active Directory via Winbind. Files created by domain users are owned by them, indicating that mapping of AD accounts to local Linux users and groups is working. But AD users get permission errors when trying to modify files created by other users, even though the file permissions are group writable. But if I log in as a regular Linux user, I can modify these group writable files without error. What am I missing? Do you have any advice on the best way to go about managing Samba in a mostly Linux environment, but using AD for authentication and the end workstations?
Yeah, so there's a couple things there. The first one is the way Samba works, especially when you're using Active Directories and Windows ACLs, is because Linux doesn't support NFS v4 ACLs by default, like Solaris and BSD and so on, Samba stores the Windows ACL permissions as extended attributes. So extra things inside the file that are normally ignored. Like when you do ls, you can't see that they're there, but you can do like the get adder command and see the extra data that's attached. And so Samba's storing the permissions from the Windows side in these extra attributes. And so when you do ls on the file and see that it's, owned by your domain / the username and that it's group writable and the group is set to, your domain / domain users, you would expect that anybody in domain users would have any permissions the group does. But actually, there's a full Windows ACL set of permissions on that file stored as kind of hidden data in that file. And Samba's using that to enforce permission controls. And it turns out in those permissions right now, you don't have group access. And so when you create a user and the second user on your home LAN tries to rename the file, they get told, that's not your file, you can't do that. Generally, the way you would fix this is from the Windows machine where you have access to the Windows ACL GUI, is if you go to the directory and go into the Windows Permissions tab and modify it there, there's a set of permissions that apply to the directory that are inherited. So any file you create in that directory is going to get this set of permissions, and you need to make sure that's set so that the domain users group is allowed to do, or whatever group you want is allowed to make the changes you want to that directory. And then there's a little tick box at the bottom of the advanced version of that tab that allows you to overwrite all existing permissions with this new set. And then that way, any new files you create will have the right permissions where the group is accessible. And you kind of just got to learn to ignore the Unix permissions. There are some settings you can do in Samba to try to keep them in sync, or in particular to try to synthesize the extra ACL permissions to match the Unix permissions, but it gets a lot more complicated. And if you don't need to try to mix them, it's easier to just deal with all of the Windows side.
Now, if you listen to all that excellent advice from Alan and your brain hurts and you're like, okay, but where's an answer for me, please? Good news, I've got a couple for you. The first is, if you're in a mostly Windows environment, maybe just go ahead and spin up a Windows file server. I understand if you don't want to run Windows on the bare metal. I don't either. Matter of fact, I refuse to do it, but that's what virtual machines are for. Run Windows in a virtual machine and you can back it up, roll it back, do whatever you need to with it. Just like, a real operating system, you just do it from above the hypervisor level. The other option, if you don't want to pay for a Windows license, which I also completely understand, or if you just want to keep everything as Unix-like as you possibly can on the back end, instead of Windows, do XigmaNAS or TrueNAS. Now, personally, I prefer XigmaNAS. I find that it's more reliable, and particularly working with Active Directory, it joins Active Directories like instantaneously, way faster than even Windows machines do. Whereas I've found that with TrueNAS, things will generally work, but you might have to, get out and push every once in a while, or maybe kick something that's misbehaving, or just sit and wait for something that's taking 40 seconds for no apparent reason. And I haven't had any of those issues with XigmaNAS. And one thing I will also point out is that both of those NAS distributions are FreeBSD based. And again, if your brain was hurting listening to Alan describe all the different things that you have to get right in order to make this work on Linux, that may give you a hint as to why the most popular NAS distributions tend to be based on BSD and not Linux.
Although increasingly, IX seem to be pushing TrueNAS Scale, which is the Debian version,
where they had to patch the Linux kernel and teach it how to do NFS v4 ACLs to not have this problem.
That ugly sound you just heard, dear listeners, that was a mic dropping.
Some settings that might help if you are stuck in an inferior ACL environment. I'll put some stuff in the show notes. And the other thing that can really trip people up is outside of the file permissions and the directory permissions, with Samba, there's also the share permissions. This comes from the protocol and from the Windows side. But there are permissions that control who can access the share, which is not the root directory. That's a separate set of permissions. And these are stored in a database in Samba, and there's not really a command line way to edit them. you have to open the computer management tool on Windows and actually change the permissions on the share, which is separate from the file permissions. Anyway, I put a link to the Samba wiki where they have some screenshots kind of walking you through how to do that.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send any questions or feedback. You can find me at joerest.com/mastodon.
I'm at mercenarysysadmin.com.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.